It always puzzled me why it took 3 centuries for Christianity to influence the entire continent of Europe and parts of 2 others, while in the past 20 centuries it's almost non-existent in India. One man was specifically charged to evangelize India, and after much research and investigation, this led me to my project, the Apostle of India. Didymus, the cousin of Jesus, was one of the 12 disciples of Jesus Christ. According to the Gnostic book, the Gospel of Thomas, Judas was his real name, but to make sure he wasn't confused with the betrayer Judas Iscariot, he was given a nickname. In Aramaic, Toma meant twin, whereas in Greek the word translates to Didymus. He was given this nickname because of his striking physical resemblance to his cousin, Jesus Christ. As a disciple of Jesus, he was the only one of the 12 to leave the Mediterranean and evangelize. After the agreement of the apostles to spread out and share the faith, Thomas argued that his special purpose was beyond the Mediterranean and onto the east, the place of the wise men. Thomas is said to have traveled through Mesopotamia where the gospel was spread and was widely accepted all throughout Persia and Kashmir. Thomas kept going though. The Gnostic books say Thomas wound up in the Himalayas where he meditated for some time. According to this literature, this is where Jesus went and he ascended after his resurrection. After some time with Jesus, he left the Himalayas, and after hearing of Mary, the mother of Jesus, was about to leave this earthly world, he headed back to Ephesus, like all the other apostles, only to find out that he arrived 3 days too late. As with all other apostles, he was grieving with her, mostly because he didn't say goodbye, so he called out to her. That is when Mary, in her transcendent body, appeared and told Thomas not to be sad. He was given her sacred belt, as she always wore, and this time wasn't the one to doubt. He was commissioned to tell all the other apostles she had risen and ascended into heaven. After the funeral, and on the eve of his departure, Thomas went to visit the Essene community of Israel. He pleaded and tried to convince the community to come with him and escape the inevitable destruction by the Romans. Some went with Thomas with his belt, and they headed for the coast, where they took a boat all the way to the southern part of India, where he landed in a place known today as Kerala in 52 AD. Thomas and the Essenes, who became Thomas's disciples, founded 7 churches on the southwest coast. Thomas stayed and evangelized for 20 years until he angered King Mazdai, who sent a hunting party to kill Thomas. On December 19th, 72 AD, Thomas was pierced by a lance. He died 2 days later. A Hindu Brahmin family near Kerala has documented family history speaking about Thomas, who went by a separate name. The disciples learned much from him, and they continued on the tradition of what Thomas taught. They were called many names by other communities throughout the next 20 centuries, but today they are known as St. Thomas Christians. Their lineage is based on teachings from Thomas that were taught as another way of Christ. Bredasian, 154-220, who was a Gnostic, said the letters written by St. Thomas referred to him as the twin brother of Christ, recipient of his secret pronouncements. The Essenes, also known as the Nazarenes, which may be a misspoken form of the word Essenes, chose only Brahmins of the highest level, Nambudiri and Nayarmini from the Kashmir, to become apostles of Thomas. The reason that the Essenes only chose Brahmins of the highest level to become apostles was that Thomas taught that the real Jesus was a Hindu Jesus, and Brahmins of this sacredness were the only ones worthy to be bodies to those priests of the people. In Sanskrit, Jesus is named Isha, meaning the Lord, which can also mean Lord of creation. The disciples of Thomas are called Ishanians, meaning of Isha, just like Lutherans are called of Luther. Ishanians say that Isha has been misspoken by foreigners, which is why the pronouncement of Jesus is the common name now, but its true form is Isha. St. Thomas' disciples acknowledged that Thomas made clear that their Indian and Hindu cultural roots were directly relevant to their faith and their God. In fact, Thomas is described as a Hindu monk, sannyasi, by a Brahmin family with historical roots of Thomas dating back to the time he landed in India. It was important to St. Thomas' disciples to keep their discipleship in Thomas, and yet not lose their study and understanding of their Brahmin roots. Even today, St. Thomas Christians still wear their thread like Brahmins. Wearing the sacred thread solidifies St. Thomas Christians as welcoming in the community. The commonalities in St. Thomas Christians with Hindus and Buddhists are striking. St. Thomas Christians consider themselves Sampradaya traditions within Sanatana Dharma. Even the Hindus in Kerala and surrounding communities agree and calls these disciples Surya Vamsa, people of the sun. They kept and continued their Hindu worship practices, and eventually the St. Thomas temples became Hindu temples, because of the Sampradaya, the tradition within Hinduism, folding in St. Thomas Christianity into the Hindu religion as a sect. Some of the temples were built within the compound of Mahadeva or Shiva. The temples of St. Thomas Christians, whose disciples were fully Brahmin and fully Christian, have assimilated into Hindu culture, where one isn't distinguishable from the other. This was purposeful design that was said to be taught by Thomas himself. And according to the disciples of Gnostic teachings, this was also alarming to the Christians of the West, who saw that these rituals and teachings were very vastly different than of Roman and Eastern Orthodoxy Christianity. As Christians, St. Thomas' disciples do not follow many of the Petrine, Pauline, and Protestant traditions as far as theological debates or tenets. They believe Thomas gave them full revelation from Jesus, and Thomas was the only one to be mentioned by Jesus since he lived with him in the Himalayas and frequently visited. The disciples believed in a distinction between Jesus the man and Jesus the Christ. They believed Jesus was man just like us and eventually gained status of Jesus the Son through enlightenment and his life duties. Many of his followers can be sons of God per their teachings. They considered being disciples of St. Thomas as the most important identifier, more than their belief in Christ or Isha, just like being Brahmin is more important identifier than just being a Hindu. It was an ownership of something specific, not broad. Jacob Kurian, teacher of theology at Kottayam Seminary in India, stated this to Christine Chariot, the author of Dhamalankara Orthodox Church, the build of Indian Orthodox Christianity, and it was based on the foundation of Sanatana Dharma, an ancient Hindu lifestyle. The theological tradition of Indian Church has to be in line with Indian philosophical traditions, not just Hindu, but Brahmins, Jnans, and others. This led to a complete submersion of Hindu tradition and cultural identity within St. Thomas Christianity. In 1498, Portuguese owned territory in southwest India and brought many European Christians with them. Upon arrival, they went to the churches of St. Thomas Christians, believing their worship was going to translate over, but they were in for a horrifying shock. The cathedrals were adorned with Thomas, Jesus, the crucifix, Shiva, Ganesha. The settlers didn't know what to think. The Portuguese built their own Catholic churches and brought their own settlers, bishops, and had their own priests. Even evangelism was separate from the St. Thomas Christians. The Indians just couldn't understand why they needed to convert, and the Hindu population understood Christianity to be a segment of Hinduism as what was taught from the past 1500 years. The tempers and frustrations continued to boil until it overlapped in the last year of the 14th century. In 1599, the Portuguese Roman Catholic Archbishop called for a summit. He requested all priests and laymen of the St. Thomas Christian Church and its disciples to meet with him and his priests in a synod to talk about commonalities and to learn more about each other's religious differences. Truly believing in the good intentions, 153 priests, 660 laymen showed up with them, and they brought their most sacred books and manuscripts, some passed down supposedly by St. Thomas himself. They even were going to bring the belt Mary had given Thomas, but that was enshrined in a temple somewhere. As they were arriving and quickly realized the meeting was not a genuine peace summit, the surrounding of Portuguese guards with drawn weapons was a good indication that the priests and laymen were forced to surrender all books, manuscripts, and literature that they had to the soldiers. The soldiers then set their things ablaze, destroying their sacred texts, and not knowing it, complete volumes of history of Christian settlement in India. It would be forever lost, and since the St. Thomas Christians worshipped Hindu gods, this was seen as an idol worship, and they were officially labeled as heretics and not followers of the Bible, but a distortion of the Apostle St. Thomas. As I personally reflected on this, I realized Christianity was folded into Hinduism, thus not being a separate religion, but being part of the greater, larger Hindu culture. And this is why Christianity never took full root inside of India. Maybe there's a reason for this. Maybe there needs to be a reemergence of Western Orthodox Christianity in India. I'm not sure, but it's very perplexing and very intriguing.